This is a history of jazz fusion. I will briefly mention jazz as a whole, and then we'll transition to jazz fusion. The roots of jazz began before 1850, but the actual jazz genre began around the beginning of the 20th century. This style was influenced by aspects of European music, church music, blues music, minstrel music, military march music, ragtime music, and utilized improvisation with these influences. Traditional jazz is often structured around popular tunes of the 1940s and 50s, using a specific chord progression. What is jazz fusion? Jazz fusion combines aspects of rock and other genres with aspects of jazz. It often doesn't structure itself around popular tune progressions. A swing style feel in rhythm is less common as well. Sometimes this genre uses weird meters. A commonality of jazz fusion is its use of electric guitars, electric basses, synthesizers, and electronic signal processing gear to modify sound. In the early 1960s, some jazz musicians started mixing aspects of rock with their music, such as guitarist Larry Coryell, who was one of the first to do this, and in 1966 became a part of the band The Free Spirits, which may have been the very first jazz fusion band. Rock musicians even began mixing in aspects of jazz into their music, including the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Cream, the Grateful Dead, Mothers, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Jazz artist Miles Davis had been wanting to change his style. He was listening to artists such as Jimi Hendrix, James Brown, and Sly Stone. He wanted to do something more guitar-driven and less abstract. In 1969, he released his album In a Silent Way. It featured several artists including jazz pianists Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea. Very interestingly, various former members of the bands Miles Davis led played a large role in the continuation of jazz fusion in the 1970s. These artists could be referred to as Miles alumni. For instance, past Miles Davis partner keyboardist Herbie Hancock first utilized this style in his album Crossings in 1972, featuring three electronic instruments, the electric piano, synthesizer, and mellotron. In 1973, he released one of the best-selling albums in jazz history, Headhunters. On this album, the song Chameleon became a hit. Many of the members in the bands that were led by the Miles alumni eventually left and started groups of their own, further exploring jazz fusion. So a domino effect seemed to be taking place at the time. An example of this can start with guitarist John McLaughlin, who was another Miles alumni. He left and started his own band, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which was one of the most influential groups in jazz fusion history. But then, former members of the Mahavishnu Orchestra went out and started their own projects. Among these artists was Jean-Luc Ponty, who went on to release albums of his own featuring his heavily processed electric violin. Ponty's song Echoes of the Future from his 1975 album Upon the Wings of Music is a good example of his violin playing. Another group started by a couple of Miles alumni was the band Weather Report in 1970. In 1976, the well-known electric bassist Jaco Pastorius became a band member. Their song Birdland from the album Heavy Weather was an anthem in the jazz fusion crowd during the 1970s. Jazz fusion artists weren't just in the US, they could also be found in Europe during the 1970s. One of the first European jazz fusion bands was British, and they were called Soft Machine. Among the most successful examples of rock and jazz mixed is the British guitarist Alan Holdsworth's 1982 album IOU. His playing in this album often emulates saxophone-like phrasing instead of guitar picking. He released albums through the 80s and 90s and is still active today. Many established jazz fusion artists continued on through the 1980s and new ones sprung up. More groups sprung up in the 1990s. This style isn't as popular today as it was in the 1970s, but it helped to break musical constraints that artists would normally be bound by. It introduced electronic instruments and aroused new ideas of structure and harmonic aspects in music. Additionally, we've received new jazz related styles that came from jazz fusion, including free funk, world music, new wave, and no wave.